Okay, man, I have a special treat for you right now. So I have everyday card collector Jason. Jason, you're on with John.
Excellent. How are you, my friend?
I'm good. So Jason has a background in printing, and I'm really excited to bring this episode to you guys because, man, we're going to learn all kind of things about the printing process and why certain things with cards exist. So, Jason, how long have you been in the printing business?
So I started, actually took the class in high school, my freshman year, so I was about 13. And I always love telling this story. When I was going into my freshman year of high school, we had the industrial tech classes, which I don't even think they exist anymore. So you did 6 weeks of automotive, 6 weeks of woodworking, electronics, architecture, printing. And I remember doing my tour in high school. My dad was with me because we knew the vice principal of this high school. He was friends of my dad, and so we were able to get a personal tour. And we went through the printing room, and I said, "This is really cool." And my dad looked at me and he said, "Well, that's what I do for a living." I had no idea what he did. I was 13 years old, and so he started describing everything that was going on in this room. I said, "Well, that's cool." I took the class, took a liking to it. I did not go to college. I went straight into the workforce as soon as I was 19 years old. Got my first job in the trade. I've been doing it since I was 19. I'm 50 now, so I took it in high school. Been doing it for a long time, and actually it runs in the family. My dad does it. It was in the industry as well. He's since retired.
Well, yeah, you've been in it for a long time. So I'm just so excited to do this episode because I think it's fascinating, and I think every single collector wonders why certain things occur on cards. So let's just delve in. The first and most obvious one that we all see are fish eyes.
Sure.
So what causes fish eyes?
So let me preface everything by saying I don't claim to be the be all end all. There are several things that could cause that. And I liken the printing industry much like to the hobby. There's always a guy out there who knows a little bit more than you when it comes to the industry.
Yeah,
But,
sure.
but that being said, there are several things, in my opinion, that can cause that. So that could be something that's either on the plate, it actually got on the plate, and there's something on the plate while it's actually printing, and it's causing that defect, if you will, on the substrate. Just so you know, offset printing isn't direct print process. So 90% of the cards that we collect, particularly vintage, are probably offset printing. There are several different forms of printing. And it's a cylinder to cylinder to cylinder to substrate, hence the word offset. It's not direct print. Flexo printing is like a giant rubber stamp. That's direct to substrate. So that big rubber stamp, it's like a giant plate, like a rubber stamp, is direct to the substrate. Offset is not like that. So with all of those cylinders, you do tend to get a little bit, especially back in the day when it was more difficult to keep things clean. You might get stuff on the cylinders or on the plates that could cause that. The other thing is everything was manual back in the day. And when I say back in the day, as far as what we're collecting, I'll stay in the 50s and 60s, and I know we collect pre-war and beyond that even. But the 50s and 60s, there wasn't a lot of technology. So everything was manual. So even building the artwork up until the point to get it print ready was all a manual process. They used to have giant horizontal cameras, and they would shoot these art boards, like a regular old art board from back in the day. People would paste stuff up, and you'd shoot it on a giant horizontal camera, and you get the film from that. And once you've had that film, you'd cut that film up in any way, shape, or form that you wanted it to build that particular sheet, card, whatever you were doing at that moment in time. It's actually called stripping. So people get a kick out of that. It's the pre-pressed. They were called the assembly operators now. They were strippers back in the day. And when you're doing all that, it's all a manual process. So creating that film is getting shot in a large vacuumed frame. And if that frame had a little dust on it, if it had a hickey on it, if it had something on that film and you didn't wipe that off and it hit the film hit the plate, and you didn't see it till it hit the press, they weren't going to remake it over back then. They were just going to let it run and just leave it be. And that's so you'll see a lot of the quote unquote hickeys or a-holes or fish eyes, they're in the same spot. And if they're in the same spot, my guess is technically that's probably on the front end before it got to cylinder. If they're in different areas, it could be on the cylinder, it could have been on the plate, and then they clean it off during the run and then it goes away. So different things can cause it though.
Oh, okay. So you mentioned hickey. That's the printer's term for fish.
Yeah,
What us
yeah,
collectors
but
call
yeah,
fish
they were
eyes, right?
a hole. Fish eye's fine. I've heard fish eye too. Everything's got a term and everything's got a phrase. Even in the printing industry, they call the same thing three different things. So yeah, but it's yeah, fish eye, a hole, hickey, all of that. I've heard all of it.
Okay, we got some technical industry terms there.
Right, right, right.
All right. So, one thing I've always been curious about is you will see that once in a while a card will have a different player's back on
Right.
it. And it's not common. So, you don't come across these often, but every once in a while, somebody just showed me a 1941 John Clooney card that had a Joe DiMaggio back on it. How does something like that happen?
Sure. So there's a couple things that could cause that as well. When you're prepping this artwork for printing, back then it was all manual, right? So let's just say it's a standard 40-inch sheet, which would be a standard size sheet for a press, 30 by 40-inch sheet. You have to build these layouts, and you're building. So if you've ever seen a press sheet, which I'm sure you have, John, and others may have, there's multiple cards on one sheet, right? It's multiple players. So that is all that was all manually built or developed on the film or the front end side of things. So it's very possible, and me being on the front end side, I've actually seen it and have been involved with it. Someone could have stripped. So you're stripping a layout for the front, then you're going to go ahead and flip it. You're going to strip a layout for the back. Let's just say the back's one color because it's black copy, or maybe it's two colors. You grabbed the wrong information about the wrong player. So the layout, you stripped in the wrong information. So basically, when it's all said and done, that information gets set up. If Pete Rose is in the upper left-hand corner, top corner of the sheet, and the stripper who was manually putting these layouts together accidentally grabbed Johnny Bench and put it in the same spot. Now
Oh,
you've got Johnny
wow.
Bench's information because it was all done by hand, right? You were stripping by hand, then you'd shoot the plate and develop the plate by hand. Now that might not get caught until 50,000 are run on the press, and then someone goes, "Jesus, what are we doing here? We got the wrong," so they'll stop it and then they'll fix it. It all depends. The quality control was far less back then, so
Sure.
that's highly likely. There's another theory that I have. There are things called perfecting presses where they print on both sides at the same time, the front and the back print. Most of them are web presses, but there are sheet fed perfecting presses. So it's possible that layouts entirely got mixed up during the perfecting press stage, but highly unlikely because that would mean every player on that sheet would be incorrect. So
Right.
it's more likely that it happened on the front end and someone actually just stripped in the wrong information. So I used to work we used to do, I don't know if you're familiar with like Ashton Drake, the dolls and the Hawthorne houses from back in the day. In the magazines, you could buy the Thomas Kincaid house and the Ashton Drake doll, the little drummer boy doll. Well, we did all of those ads, and occasionally you would strip in the wrong ad for the wrong doll or house, and then and it would get far enough where you're like, that's not even the correct information. So,
Yeah.
and that was in the late '90s that was happening. So
Now, well, along those lines, what about blank backs?
So yeah, I was trying to think about that. You and I had a brief conversation. You said, "How did blank backs happen?" Um, there are a couple theories that I have. So there could have been make ready. Make ready would have been you're setting up the press prior to the actual full run. You're running off a few. Maybe you're going to run off 300. Make sure it gets up to color and everything looks good. And you're only going to run the front because the back is a one color back or two color line art. There's no photographs or pictures. It's just line art. So you get that make ready done, and somehow that make ready makes it to the stack of complete runs, and it gets cut up and shipped out with everything else. So it's possible that it was make ready by mistake, so that there's a few of them. And then it also could be, again, the front end layout situation could have been joggled or mixed up, or maybe they had 40 guys on the front of a sheet, but they knew they only had the information for 37 and they were going to plug in the information on the last three later on, and it didn't happen. There's a lot of things that could have occurred, but it's all manual. Like now it's so much different. Like all of this was man-made and mechanical, if you will, as opposed you could. And nowadays, I mean, if you talk to anybody under the age of 35, everything's electronic in printing, so they wouldn't have a real grasp of all of this stuff.
For the blank backs, is it possible that when they ran the back, it ran out of ink?
I wouldn't sit in. I don't think it's possible if it's a one color back, maybe. But if it's a two color back, you'd have to run out of ink in two ink
Yeah,
wells.
yeah, yeah.
So it would have to be like only black copy. If you're
Okay.
talking about like a 39 play ball where it's only black copy. But it also could be, and again, if it's rare, if it's a real rare blank back and there's not a lot of them, if it was a sheet fed press, sometimes you could have feeding problems with the press where two sheets go in at one time by mistake. Right?
Ah,
So if they printed the front, if it wasn't a perfecting press and they ran 100,000 of the front, they let it dry, then they flip the stock and they're going to print the one color backs through the same press, just through the black only for the black only. It could grab one or two or three sheets by mistake, most likely two. It wouldn't be more than that because it's pretty thick stock, and it could skip a sheet, and that sheet is already collated into the big 500,000 run or 100,000 run. It gets cut up and shipped out. That's when you get into the rarity, like, oh, there was only we only know 6 of them or 7 of them. I would guess something like that happened in that particular case. But full blown blank backs, like if there's a lot of them and it's the quote unquote error card, I would say it was a front end mistake in prepping up the artwork. Would be my guess.
okay. One thing that's always blown my mind is how you'll have a card that's perfectly centered on the front and off centered on the back. The
Right.
back's off center.
Right. So
Or vice versa. How does that happen?
Right. So again, if it's a perfecting press, things move on press, right? So if you print that front and it looks beautiful and everything's centered perfectly on the front, and you run it on the back, that sheet, again, it's a mechanical function. A press is. It could be moving through the press. It could be moving at any moment in time. Cylinders can be hopping, and it's going to move. So it's not going to be perfect from side to from front to back every single time. It could also be the cutting process. The cutting process is something that I always get a kick out of. We mentioned briefly, I'm talking on a side conversation, miscut cards or minimum size met makes me laugh because it's like the goofiest reason not to grade a card, in my opinion. But
Yeah, I wanted to get into that. So, how you have certain cards that are notoriously off centered, and for all the cards, some are centered, some are not centered. How does that happen in the cutting process? I assume they were trying to cut them all centered.
Sure. So I would have to say it probably depends on where it is in the layout. If you can tell that some are drastically off centered, a lot of them are corners of the layout, right?
Yeah.
And so as a sheet gets wider and wider and wider, even in a cutting process, you work from center out. So the farther you go out from center, the more it is the harder it is to control those ends, right? It's harder. Things move. And how they used to cut things back in the day. I mean, I can tell you, and this goes back to my high school day. We had a giant cutter, and if you had 300 sheets, you would put it back. You would put it in the cutter. You'd spin the dial, and let's say cards are 3 inches wide, and I've got 5 rows of cards. You'd set that dial at 3 inches, and just jam that thing to the back. It would bring it up, to 3 inches. And then you press 2 buttons and a big weight comes down first before it cuts to kind of hold everything. But that's pressure. The minute that blade hits, if you're talking to something that's this thick, that's still going to move, right? As perfect and as sharp as that blade may be, things stretch, things squeeze. And in those 300 sheets alone, you could put them, if you put a micrometer on them, they're probably not all exact. In that one stack alone, depending on the thickness of the stock. So to me, cutting is the easiest print defect there is for stuff that we collect, 50s, 60s, 70s. Nowadays, it's all electronic. Everything is digital. Everything is, you save steps.
Yeah, and to be clear, I mean we're mostly speaking on this program about vintage cards.
Correct.
Clearly, the modern cards don't have the same issues. They have maybe a few different issues, but not the same issues as the vintage cards.
Yeah.
And oh, go ahead.
I was gonna say I get a kick out of it because the people say on the new cards, like I watch them ripping 2023, and they're like, "Look at this print line." Well, that's not a print line; that's a dat line, and and that's because of electronics, because everything is electronics now.
Yeah.
Like it's kind of a print line, but it's what I would call a dat line or an electronic.
Well, what is a dat line?
So a dat line would be when you're talking about printing, everything is screened, right? And when I say screened, standard printing is 4-color process: yellow, magenta, cyan, and black. If you take those 4 colors, if I took a picture of you as you're sitting here right now, snap that picture and separated it in a 4-color process, you would lay those colors down one at a time. And when you lay down that 4th final color, it would look like this, because those 4 colors can cover so much of the color gambit in the rainbow that's why it was selected 4-color process.
Okay, so those are the proofs that Topps Vault sold, the progressions.
Correct.
What are they called? Progressive proofs?
Progressive proofs. That is correct. So back in the day, you'd get a print line, and I kind of went off track. We're talking printing. I can talk a while. So back in the day, you would get a print line. It might be from a roller hopping. They call it chatter.
Yeah.
They call it chatter. So you'd see a print line. Well, there is none of that anymore. But what you do have is electronics. Like if you scan something nowadays, you'll even see, if you're looking on eBay at cards, there's a little line that goes across, and someone will say that's a scanner line. That's not in the card. That to me is a dat line. It's an electronic print line, if you will. It's created based on how it's getting scanned or how it was getting exposed and run to the plate. You'll see those lines on occasion. So
okay, I think those of us who collected vintage cards, we all had those little black print lines on there.
Yes,
so that explains it.
Yeah, that the print line to me would probably most likely be hop on press or roller skipping, and chat. They called it chatter. So
chatter. Okay.
Yeah.
Along those same lines, when we're talking about cutting cards, what causes the the rough cuts, mostly found on O-Pee-Chees, but also found on Topps? I mean, some of the O-Pee-Chees, they look like they were cut with a wire or a hacksaw.
Yeah. And my response to that would be technology of the day is what created that, right? So the more you shave with a razor, the duller it gets. The more you cut with that cutter, the duller it gets, right? And it's gonna be rougher. It's gonna be harder to go through X amount of stock and X amount of sheets, and it's gonna start to rough cut. And it depends where that is also in the stack. A lot of times the rough cut happens towards the end. If I'm cutting 2,000 sheets, maybe the last 300 get that rough cut. It's nice and clean up front, and then it kind of bogs down towards the end. And that's all technology and keeping a sharp blade and how the cutters worked back then and things of that nature.
So those cutters needed sharpened regularly?
Yeah, possibly. And again, I don't know the ins and outs as to how often you needed to sharpen it, but yeah, absolutely. It's like any other blade, right? It's like a knife. You got to keep it sharp, otherwise it's going to dull out, and it's going to be more difficult to cut through that stock.
Interesting. So one thing I wanted to talk about is recently, the PSA has been kicking back an extreme number of cards for minimum size met.
Right.
And a lot of us vintage collectors, we have recollection of growing up and opening these packs, and all the cards weren't the exact same size. Can you speak to that a bit?
Yeah, I can.
On how, were they all the exact same size?
So I'm going to go on a little Mangini rant here. There is no way that PSA can designate a size as being an exact size. So they can say the intent was the card to be X by X, call it 3x4. And I know that's not, I'm just using round terms here. But at the end of the day, with the technology that I just mentioned on what happens with cuts and all the manual labor that went into this, and none of it was digital, it just was impossible to keep things that regulated in the 50s and the 60s, even the 80s. I've seen people, other videos in the hobby, within the vintage community, people will be holding a stack of 1981 tops, and they put them together, and you can see just along the edge, they're not.
Well, those are the ones I'm talking about. Those are the ones I opened as a kid.
Yeah.
I didn't open 50s and 60s.
Right.
In the 70s and 80s, I noticed it just in my stack that they weren't all precisely, the exact same size.
So what makes PSA? Now I'm going to sound like you. So what makes PSA the expert on that then? How can you
Well,
claim to be the expert on that?
I don't know. I have a theory, but I know nothing about it. I just had I have a theory that maybe they're implementing some AI and their standards are absolutely precise because there are far too many cards getting kicked back for minimum size.
Sure.
Far too many.
So my response to that would be how do you regulate, particularly vintage? How do you apply an AI mandate slash regulation to something that printed in 1955? It's
Right.
impossible because it was all manual, it was all mechanical. So
Oh,
to
and when
be
you get into the 33 Gaudi or the
right there,
41
yeah,
play balls, it's even
yeah.
worse.
So I mean, how do you? Which always makes me laugh when I look at, and I'm going off, and I apologize, John. When I look
No,
at
that's all right.
when I look at the Goodwin champions and how beautiful those cards are, think about how
Yeah.
old they are and
Yeah.
how much time that took to create those. So that kind of gives you a little more appreciation for that kind of stuff. I mean, if you
Yeah, they
look,
are beautiful, and it's
yeah,
unbelievable you could still find them in such, nice condition.
right, right. But yeah, I guess what I'm saying is minimum size not met in the stuff that we collect, being vintage and below to pre-war. It's going to be counted. That's why they're getting kicked back. So now they've got this regulation that is unheard of, and you're not going to be able to hold to that standard because that's not how they were. That's not how they were manufactured. It'd be
Yeah.
impossible. So that's just my opinion on it.
And I think you may have answered, but I always wondered on the drastic miscuts and the diamond cuts.
Yeah.
Is that
So,
just the sheet moving
but
when that weight comes down on it before it's
yeah,
cut?
possible moving during cutting stage. It might already be when you had said if you're using a perfecting press and the front and the back aren't exactly perfect, it might be a little cocked. It might only be cocked to one side of a 40-inch sheet. So maybe it's just the last row on the left side that gets diamond cut, right? And it's going to get diamond cut along the right edge because depending on where the blade is. So all of those, if there's 5 in a row, are going to get diamond cut now. So now it's just not going to just be one card. It's going to be multiple cards. But it was all manual, mechanical issues that create all the things that we call diamond cut and print lines and snow and all of that. All of that I look at all that and I'm like, this is just how it was. And to me, it brings more character to the cards. Now, obviously, the 60 Yaz rookie, there's always a lot of black dots on it, and I'm not certain if that was splatter or what that is exactly.
I noticed that on the 61 Yaz,
Yeah,
little black dots.
yeah. So I'm not certain if that was just some sort of something on the front end or the back end. I'd have to look at it more carefully, but it's clearly just print issues, right? That's what it
Yeah.
is. That's what
Yeah.
diamond cut is. That's what fish eyes are. And we had talked about some other sets that I wondered the special edition, special colors of certain sets. Are those even where they actually print mistakes? I think we had brought up briefly when you and I were chatting the green tint, the 62 green
Yeah,
tints.
I was going to get to that. The
Yeah.
62 green tints. So what's the deal with those?
I don't know, and I don't know enough about them. But the first time I really, and again, I'm only 4 or 5 years into vintage here, so I was watching Rocket Rick's channel, and he was showing me all the green tints and versus the standard, and I was looking at some of them, going, well, is that just a printing mistake? Is that just too much cyan on the one? Although you brought up an awesome point, and I never thought of that, and 100% correct. Was it printed somewhere else? Could be that simple. Was it a different facility? And
Yeah.
that could do all of that. Certainly do all
That
of that.
was my thinking because, when I was little, I had 62s and I noticed the green tints, although I never would have thought to call them green tints. They don't look green to me. They just look a little more blurry or something.
Right.
It's hard to describe, but I noticed them, and I just printing for old cards just had little nuances. I never thought anything about it.
Right.
Um, so yeah, I don't know what caused that, or if it was just the
I
colors, or if it was printed somewhere else,
I actually
or
lean.
if
I
they
actually
changed.
lean.
Could they have
Yeah.
changed a machine in the middle of the season?
Right.
You like I, you know,
So I actually lean towards when you and I were talking briefly. I lean towards your explanation is far more reasonable than mine because that would be a large printing mistake. My thought behind all of that is, and it's It's something to keep in mind. Everything affects it. Humidity affects printing, right? Humidity affects printing just as much as it would for, like, I don't know if if you are into music or anything, but guitar players, you take your guitar in and out of the heat, and that neck bends because of it, right? And you have to be careful, and it's no different for printing and stock. There's a lot of printers in Mexico now, and they have to deal with the humidity and regulate their rooms for humidity and things. All of that makes a difference. The Kellogg's that you and Orlando used to talk about, that they would curl,
Yeah.
right? Some of that's because of humidity, and then if you try to straighten them because there's plastic, it just cracks. So all of that affects how things print.
I'm glad you brought that up. So you will find some Kellogg's that don't have like the 3D effect, that they're almost like a regular card. How does that happen?
I wouldn't know. I can tell you the difference between what, like, the sports flicks are actually, that's called lenticular printing, which is a form of printing. But the
Yes.
3D effect itself from one Kellogg's, like if 76 look 3D but 75 don't, I'm not familiar. I
No, I'm
wouldn't.
talking about that. What do you call it? Lenticular? Lenticular?
Lenticular, yeah.
Yeah. So some of them come without that. It has that like rough on the
Yeah, it's like
outside.
lines. It's lines. It's like it's all like little plastic lines, right? And then you
Yeah.
move it and it can do all that. So that is a form of printing called lenticular. I don't know the details of it. If they're not running certain sets lenticular but running others, I can tell you back in the day it was an expensive process. So it could have been a matter of cutting costs and going, we're not going lenticular for the 73 set. Or is it card to card? Is it card to card in a set, or is it just sets?
Yeah, that's what I was asking about. Some that do have the lenticular, but there's one off that doesn't have it.
Yeah,
Like
that
I
I
like I have I forget the year. I think it's like an 83 Dave Parker. I have two versions. One doesn't have it, one does have it.
Oh, that's interesting. I'd be curious, and so potential what they did on different runs. Maybe the first 200,000 we're going to have it. The second 300,000 weren't. We're going to run the heck out of this, and we're going to save cost on the back end by not applying any of
Is
that type of printing.
was it possible just to miss one card on the print run
I don't
or
think,
one sheet?
no. Most likely, you sure? I mean, that's all. I wouldn't say one card. I would say one sheet. It's
Okay.
possible. That would be possible. But again, not knowing enough about lenticular, because it's almost like a plastic and it's almost like a level of printing. And I don't know enough about it. I don't want to misspeak, but I do know it was an expensive process. So my thought would
Yeah.
be maybe they're just cutting it back at that point.
Yeah, that'd be interesting to see how those were printed actually. What so something else I wanted to bring up was, and I noticed this specifically for, let's say, 1974 tops, 1975 tops in there. I noticed this the most, where some cards, especially 75, I think, well, both of those years, some cards are real heavy printing, like almost too heavy, and then other cards, the same card, a different copy, will be real super light, and you hold them together like one's real dark and one's real light. Is that just a matter of maybe the first batch run with when they put new ink in, and the other card that's faint is when they were running out of ink? Is it
That
just that simple?
They could very well be that. So the density, so basically all of that ink that's laying down on that substrate, you're supposed to hit a density. They take density readings as it's going through the run, and the whole point is to keep consistent and keep that density consistent. Well, maybe the technology wasn't there in the 70s and the 60s and the 80s, so they would just run and it would start to fade, right? So
Yeah.
your 75 George Brett is a little bit lighter than mine because mine was in the middle of the run and yours was towards the end of the run. And then they actually either swapped out or loaded new ink. And again, to your point, because I don't know the ins and outs about what Topps did and who they used, possible different printer, you know, I would be curious to look at like a mass quantity of the same cards to see if it's the same stock even, because someone might have changed up stock a little bit, which can change up the hue of a card. Possible. These are all just things that could have happened. I would lean towards what you were saying, front end of the run, middle of the run, or back of the run is most likely the plausible thing for that.
Okay. Um, a big topic I wanted to talk to you about with the popularity of the '84 Star Jordan.
Yeah.
Now, there are rumors that one of the printers they used was based in his garage, And when you look at those cards, and when we looked at them growing up, we always viewed them as kind of homemade cards. They're not very complicated. Well, how easy would it be to reprint those?
It wouldn't be difficult at all, and especially in this day and age with electronic technology, it would be very easy to do. So because what you're doing is you're asking, we have modern technology, and you're asking me to print something to make it look like it was printed in 1984 and 1985, and I can certainly do that. Like, actually, even the reprints might look too good, where you have to kind of, you've seen it where people are scuffing up reprints because they look too good, because they know the quality is actually better than when it actually ran. But electronically now, you could probably scan a card. You could scan it in, get it into the system, direct to plate. So all that stuff that I was talking about, building layouts by hand, all of that's gone now. It's all digital. It's from computer to plate now. So you get that in the computer, get it into your system. You can represent it right on the plate and go. There will always be differences when you take an original and then you dupe that out multiple times. It starts to lose its characteristics. It becomes less sharp. It becomes, less foggier, less crisp. So, but the 84 star cards weren't that crisp to begin with. So,
Yeah, but do you think you could duplicate the paper when you held it under a loop? Would the printing dots look the same? All that stuff?
no. So if you were to take if you knew what was real to be real, and you would compare it to the actual the repop of it, there's a high probability that the structure of the dots and how they're laying down would be slightly different. You could get it up to color pretty close, but the pattern itself could
So the
possibly
pattern would be off, and you would be able to tell the difference.
possibly, yeah. It'd be very difficult, because what they did in '84 when they built that out of four-color process, that was all manual with film. Now you're going to represent that electronically, and then you're going to try and dupe what you did manually. And it's possible that the system that you're plugging this into could read that four-color process differently. So the dot structure would be different. It's possible that the structure and how they laid the yellow down in '84 versus 2024, the dots might not be in the exact same spot. But very difficult to figure that out, right? I mean, it would be hard. You'd read. I don't claim to be a printing expert, but you need a pressman who's been doing this for years and looking through loops to go, yeah, that's a fake and that's a real. It would be difficult to see. If you can get it up to color and you know what the stock is, I think you could replicate it. I think you could replicate anything from back in what we collect, as far as what we collect vintage wise.
If somebody did print those in his garage and still had the printer, would that thing still be running?
Sure, sure. And I tell you what, it wouldn't take much. You could print. You had mentioned this story to me, and I said I actually knew a guy who started his business. He took print class in high school, left high school, didn't go to college. He bought two presses and he started his print business in his garage, and he was printing in his garage. And you start with what I call line art, meaning no photographs, no pictures. It's just line art, like business cards, and he progressed up. But sure, you can get all that. I mean, my print class in high school wasn't, we went through all the forms of printing that don't even exist anymore, letterpress and things of that nature. But you could dupe out some pretty good stuff even in high school if given the shot. So
What about vintage cards? Would it be hard to reproduce those with modern printing? Because I mean, I rarely, if ever, see a legitimate looking vintage card
well,
that's a
that's
reprint.
that's the thing. So you're asking, can I represent a 54? Can I dupe out a 54 Hank Aaron enough to fake everybody out? To me, it would be very difficult because of the stock that was used at that point in time. The process to actually get to that was all manual and mechanical, and now you're going to have a guy behind a computer trying to run all that off. And even if you tried to replicate the manual process of it, it would be very difficult. To me, you're asking to represent something that was it's a part of the industry that doesn't exist anymore, and now you're going to try and replicate a card from that part of the industry. It's going to be very hard to do.
Yeah. Well, back to the star cards for a second. The '86 Fleer Michael Jordan. they've made some good looking fakes of that.
Yeah. Yeah, and that's the decade, that's the generation. Why you asked about the stars, and I said, yeah, that wouldn't be hard to do, because that stock is still available. The '86 Jordan. I mean, if you look at a real, it was considered, if it's graded a real '86 Jordan, the image is very fuzzy. It's not a
Yeah.
real clear cut image. The everything around the actual photo of himself dunking or going in for the dunk, it's all line art. It's very easy to replicate. So they've been faking that card forever. And I had heard from some people, oh, check the yellow of the little arrow pointing to flare. If it's
Yeah.
dark, it's not real, and that's probably true. There's probably some validity to that. Maybe if that's a spot color, not built out of process, maybe the card was built with PMS 108 yellow and the faker used PMS 110 yellow by mistake. I mean, it could
Yeah,
be.
another thing on the back, the emblem, what is it? The NBA emblem is fuzzier on the reprints. It's not
Yeah,
as crisp and clean.
right. But I would think you could, it's line on the back, it's line art. I would think you could fake that pretty well. That's why it kind of surprises me.
Now, I saw in some cases with modern ink versus older ink, you can use a blue light, and the modern ink just like lights up,
Yeah,
and the vintage doesn't. It stays dull.
yeah. So I think, and again, I'm not an ink expert, but I do know that there have been huge advancements in ink, and which would be another reason why it'd be more difficult to replicate a 52 tops as opposed to a 86 Jordan or a 90, mid 90s card. But I don't know what the differences are in inks, and now they're a little bit more. They're a little bit more translucent, have more viscosity, and all of that matters. And the pigments that are used, I just don't know enough about that.
Yeah, I saw a guy who was taking real Michael Jordan Fleer rookies and fake ones, and he was using the black light, and the fakes were lighting up, like, lighting up. Some seller had included a Michael Jordan rookie in with one of my packages, and I'm sure it's a fake. So I tried that. I put it next to mine, and it did not light up. It was dull.
Right.
So it's clearly possible to make fakes that don't light up.
Yeah.
So that blue light is not 100%, definitely not 100% to be able to tell.
Yeah, and that,
From
and that would make sense to me. I mean, right? I mean, it's no different than counterfeiting money, right? The counterfeiters get better and better as time goes on, and they have to adapt because of the way we're changing to prevent counterfeiters. There's inlays in the dollar bills now, and there's strips, there's all sorts of things. There's holograms and all sorts of things like that. On an 86 Flair Jordan, there was none of that, right? So I mean,
yeah,
you can find all of the ways, whether it's the same ink and the same pigment that was used in '86, you can probably still find that. I mean,
it's probably a little difficult to fake the exact paper, though, the paper stock, cardboard stock, because like with mine, I mean, just looking at it, it doesn't look right. Like the reprint I have is very whitish, and the real one's not quite that white.
yeah, it's like a yellow tinge almost, or just like a faded off-white tinge.
Yeah, I mean, it looks white until you put it next to bright white, and then it
Right,
doesn't look white
right,
anymore.
right,
It's like when you are painting your house, you have white walls, and you just go buy a white paint, and you notice it doesn't match at all because
right.
there's 102 different shades of white that I found
Exactly.
out when I tried to do that. um, so just looking at it just looks off, right?
Yeah,
Like that's one though. That particular card is tough, and I've seen some tops reprints of the tops Wayne Gretzky rookie that look pretty darn good too. But those are really the only ones I've seen that really, most of the ones I see are blatant. Like as soon as I look at them, I know they're not real.
right.
And the one thing I wanted to ask you with that '86 Fleer, one last thing with that Jordan, is you were saying how the image on the real card isn't that clear to begin with, and that's absolutely right. But when you're reprinting something, you have to take a picture of the card, right? So you're taking a picture of a picture basically.
Yep.
And can you, in the modern printing game, make that as crisp as the original image?
I don't think so.
Or would
I,
it be
I,
a little more
I think
blurry?
I think it would start to look too fake then, right?
Yeah.
So much like I said earlier, once you start going from generation to generation, it's kind of like I'll equate it to Rick Oddball card or vintage oddball cards. He says type 1, type 2, type 3, right? It's a photo of a photo of a photo kind of deal, and it starts to lose its crispness and its sharpness. Could you probably fake it? I guess you could. I don't know enough about actually the technology and what it would take to do that, but I almost think it would look too fake then at that point in time, right? That's that happy medium. That
Yeah.
mid 80s stuff is that stuff where it was like, it looked okay and it looked good, but it wasn't great. And now you have to try and replicate that. And the only way to me would be photo of a photo, like you said, and it would lose some of its crispness.
Yeah, I wonder, about the star cards, and I also wonder about like the minor league cards, like the pro cards and some of the other ones, the TCMAs. They just look like they're homemade. It doesn't look to a layman that, it would be that difficult to reprint them if you knew what you were doing and had the printing
Yeah,
materials.
and quite honestly, that's just because when they printed them, the TCMAs and things of that, and minor league cards of that nature, they weren't using. I mean, it was just probably a lower grade quality printer, lower grade art. There wasn't a whole lot put into them. It wasn't the razzle dazzle of the 54 tops or anything like that. But so yeah, you're particularly black and whites would be easy to replicate because there's no color to worry about. Then at that point in time, it's one color, it's black. The stock would be the bigger concern. Could you fake a 39 play ball? Yeah, if you can get that stock, you could probably fake one pretty well because it's a half tone, it's a one color image. So
But getting that stock would probably be difficult.
that'd be very difficult. That'd be very difficult. You're looking for stock from 1939 would be very hard. So
Yeah. One thing I wanted to ask you about as well was printing plates. In modern cards, they'll insert printing plates, and oftentimes they're one of one, but sometimes they're one of 10.
right.
Explain how are these things legitimate? How can there be 10 printing plates?
So the one of 10 is this big, right? The printing plate that three, I don't know what a standard, I don't even know what a standard size card is. 3 by whatever, 2 and 7/8, whatever it is. Call it 3 by 5. That's inaccurate because that's too big. But a card that's 3 by 5 is not running on a press by itself. It's running on a sheet of 40 other cards. So if they were all Derek Jeter cards, there are 40 impressions of that card on 4 different plates, on your yellow plate, on your magenta plate, on your cyan, on your black. So you've got 40 times 4 now. You're talking about 160 one-up images. And
Okay.
that's only if you went through one set of plates. If the run calls for 1 million and these plates start dying at 500,000, they're going to make another set of plates. So now you're 160 times 2 if you had a double the run, right? So now you're talking 320 single impressions. So the only way it could be one of one to me is if it was mandated that the printing company had to destroy all plates minus one impression, and then it
Okay.
could be a one of one. But I can guarantee you, it wasn't printed as a one of one. It was on a sheet. So I guess
Well, that's interesting. So
yeah,
you would have to trust the card company that they did indeed destroy the others,
right. And we
or
and
an employee could have walked out with
that's
5 more of them.
that's exactly right. That's exactly right. I will say this. We chatted briefly. In the early 90s there was a printer in my area that was printing baseball cards, and I can't remember what it was. It was during I've never worked directly for a printer. I'm on the front end. I'm on all that design and build the artwork stuff. But most of the people that I work with have worked at printers, and they worked at one and they were printing baseball cards, and there were guys ganking sheets left and right taking them home. Now again, this was the mass production error.
Oh
I mean,
man.
taking one didn't mean a whole heck of a lot. That sheet's probably worth $10. If it was 89
Yeah.
Donruss or 91 Flair, it doesn't mean a whole heck of a lot. But the thought being that could have been done in 1952 with tops, right?
Well, yeah, it could have, and there are certainly stories of test issues that were never distributed that employees took home, like the 1972 cloth test.
Yeah,
Like those sheets came from employees. The 76 tops cloth test, those made their way out of the garbage or wherever. So
sure.
certainly possible. We know for a fact that some of the stuff was taken from the factory by employees.
Yeah. And I preface the one of one plate thing because my knowledge of printing is large format printing. I guess it's possible, I should say now, depending on how it's worked out, that they're actually just making smaller plates for one run, for one hit, and that's it. I wouldn't know anything about that. The business end of printing that I'm in is the packaging side of things. So we deal with lots of stuff and large stuff and everything you see in your grocery store and things of that nature, bigger cartons. I deal with that. So to me,
Okay.
I find it difficult that someone's going to print a single card with a single set of plates and then that's it. To me, it's on a 40-inch sheet or even a 26-inch sheet, 24-inch sheet. There's more impressions of that on a plate somewhere besides that one plate that you pulled out of a pack. I find it hard to believe.
Okay. Well, I mean, I know you don't work for Topps printers or anything,
Right, right,
but
right.
you do know about printing,
Yeah.
and I think you shed a lot of light on a lot of questions I had, and probably a lot of people who are watching had the same questions. So I want to thank you for joining me. Is there anything else you wanted to talk about or bring up or mention before
No,
we wrap this up?
I guess I'll wrap it up very easily. So as long as I've been doing this, I jokingly take all of my print knowledge out of my hobby experience. I enjoy I enjoy uncentered cards. They don't have to be perfect for me. I don't mind a fisheye every now and then. A print mark doesn't bother me too much. Matter of fact, it kind of makes me giggle. So, I rattle all of this stuff out, and I'm probably the least picky when it comes to You have said it many times. Been watching your channel since before I was on YouTube, and it's the card speaks to you. It speaks to you, and that's how I look for cards. So
That's how I look for cards too, and with the grading and the fact that you can go on to eBay or elsewhere and have 100 choices and pick that perfect card, and everybody doing videos showing you the different flaws
right,
and this and centering becoming uh, more popular. You could get carried away and having every card be perfect, and that's certainly not how I collect. And I don't know, it's not even that wouldn't even be fun for me to have every card perfect. And in fact, I would question if they were real
it's too much
when they look
work.
too good. Yeah,
Too
when
much
I
work.
see the old cards from the turn of the century, the early 1900s, and they're in sevens, eights, I question that. I really do.
We
Not
saw some of those at the National too.
Yeah, I mean, I don't know. I don't know anything, but I have to question it.
Right.
Cards that are 100 years old and older that are just in pristine condition.
No, I
It's
agree.
makes you wonder. All right, Jason, I appreciate it so much. Again, Everyday Card Collector Jason. I will put a link to his channel in the description of this video. Go check him out. Jason, thanks for being on with John.
John, thank you. I appreciate it. Being with Mr. Mangini is always a pleasure, and I'd love it. Anytime you need me, I'm on. So just call.
Okay, and everyone, thanks for hanging out with us.